Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and one of the most interesting things to look for when you're out photographing in the street is very dramatic light, specifically shafts of light. It creates a scenario where you have some strong illumination plus some dark shadows that can create a contrast that not only directs the viewer's eye to exactly what you want to see, but just creates a very dramatic and punchy shot. And I chose 3 images that exemplify this and will allow me to talk about some of the technical challenges that you might face when you see such light and you want to capture a specific kind of look with your camera. Here we have a shot by Matthew Lille. We don't have any XF information here. This is a great scene. This looks like it's probably New York City. And you have these nice shafts of light that are here in the crosswalk, and you can also see it in the building in the far right. Now, one of the reasons I love shooting in New York is that because of the high skyscrapers and the different times of day, you can get these shafts of light that cut through the city, and when done effectively, can produce some really, really interesting shots. Now, the big challenge is if you're using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, most of them have what's called a multi-pattern metering or matrix metering or some variation on that. And what the camera does, it breaks up the scene into individual cells, and it evaluates each part for light, for contrast, sometimes with focusing distance, and makes a bunch of different calculations, all in an attempt to give you as good of an exposure as it possibly can. So it would look at all this shadow area, look at all this highlight area, and try to give you what it thinks is a good exposure. The problem with a scene like this is if you allow the camera to do that, it will try to open up all these shadows in order to give you a good exposure for the entire frame, which is not what you want. You want to have an exposure that's biased for the highlights and allow the shadows to go dark and go black. And even though you're losing some detail in the shadows, you're not risking the highlights, which is the most important part of the shot, being blown out and overexposed. Because even if you're using a raw file format, you still may end up overexposing the scene, at least here in the highlights, so much that you can't retrieve that highlight detail, and the exposure is a wash. So what Matthew has done here, he's exposed for the highlight area and gets really nice detail in the people that are walking here across the street, including these 2 ladies who are wearing some orange, and the other fellow here who's crossing into the street. The latitude of most of today's cameras are such that even if you're exposed for the highlight, as Matthew does here, you still retain some shadow detail. So if you wanted to open it up, you probably could without exaggerating too much noise that may be present in those images. And there are several different ways you can do it. You can go in manual exposure mode, expose for the highlights, and then it won't open up the shadows because you're in complete control of the exposure. Or you could use the spot meter of your camera to target the exposure area for here, lock your exposure using the exposure lock button, and that way the camera won't try to override the exposure to open up the shadow area. Again, it's 2 different ways of being able to do that. There's even a third way of purposely using the exposure compensation feature of your camera and biasing the exposure to -2 or -3 or -1, whatever your LCD screen is indicating to you would be appropriate for the scene. There are 3 different ways of doing it, and I don't have the opportunity here to sort of show you the 3 different ways, but if you do a search on YouTube for using exposure compensation, spot metering, or locking exposure, you'll probably get some really great examples of how to do either of those 3. So when you face a similar situation, you would be able to get an exposure that's biased for the highlights and get results that are as nice as this. Here's a shot by Philippe, shot with a Canon EOS 6D at 125th of a second at f9. At ISO 125. So this is a mirror image. So we have this woman that's sort of walking away from herself in these images. But again, we're dealing with these shafts of light. It looks like to the back of Philip, there was a window through which the light was passing through, and the frame of the window creates the pattern of the shadow that surrounds her as she moves from wherever she was coming from to the edges of the frame, and that's mirrored on the right-hand side. It's exactly the same kind of exposure situation that we saw in the previous shot, in which the exposure has to be biased for the highlight detail. And with a scene like this, or with any other scene, it's really easy to do well before your subject enters the frame, because when you are walking around the street and you see light like this, you can stop and adjust your exposure even before your subject comes into the frame. Because once you've established the exposure and you know you've nailed it, then it's just a matter of waiting and being patient about people walking into the frame. And I do this all the time. I'll find a lighting situation that's much like this. I'll frame my composition. I'll bias my exposure in whatever way I think is appropriate. And then I'll just wait as different people walk into the scene. And as soon as they step into that shaft of light, I make a picture. And when I find situations like this, I may be there for 5, 10, 15 minutes, sometimes even longer, looking for just the right subject to help complete the shot. And that's sort of the secret, if there's any other secret beyond the technical stuff that you're doing with the camera, is not settling for just 1 or 2 shots, because it's essential to find the right subject and to time it right so that they're doing something that, in terms of the frame, provides some interesting sort of body language or gesture, or maybe even something about their clothing or where the hair is, or something that they're carrying that does something more than just having a figure in that highlight. I like the blue and the gray that this woman is wearing, because it's a nice counterpoint to the warmer colors that exist not only on the wall itself, but also in the bottom here on the ground. And that gray kind of complements the gray of the rail that we see near the bottom of the frame. She's perfectly positioned in that area of highlight there. The black of her hair, the profile of her face, the placement of her hands and her legs, even the shoes are in just the right place to help really define her shape in relationship to everything else that's happening here. But again, Philip, as with Matthew in the previous shot, really nails the exposure and is really on top of timing to make sure that the subject is in the right place in order to complete the composition. Lastly, we have a shot by Stuart Pathan, and no EXIF information here. This is a little more complicated shot, but we're still dealing with very similar lighting situation. You're dealing with light that's coming from the right. There's a shaft of light coming to the right, which is illuminating the boy here. It's also light that's illuminating the area behind this window. So the light that's hitting this boy is the same light that's hitting the building in the back. So if you expose for the boy anything that light is falling on, whether it's inside of this room or outside, is going to have the same exact exposure. So you don't really have to take like 2 different readings to determine what the exposure is outside or inside, because it's exactly the same. So you can bias the exposure in the ways that we've mentioned in the previous 2 shots, and allow everything else to fall in a shadow. Now, we are getting little kisses of light elsewhere, like here on the edge of this, what looks like to be like a figure or something. The adult male in this shot, we get this great profile here. It's great that his head was slightly turned, because you get the profile of his nose, the ridge of his brow, his chin. That helps define him, because otherwise, if he were facing straight towards the camera, it would be really hard to sort of define that this is an actual person, other than just the presence of the shoulders in the frame. Stuart here also has some nice separation between what this thing is here, whether it's a chair or a figure or a sculpture. I'm not really sure. And then there are little kisses of light here as well that help prevent this area here from going completely black. But again, if you were allowing the camera's default metering system to handle the exposure for you, what would likely happen is that you would have an exposure that was biased for all this shadow area here. It would open up the shadow. We would see the details on the guy's face, everything that's in the interior, but the boy, especially his jacket, would be blown out. It would be overexposed. So you would have to do a whole bunch of work in Lightroom or Photoshop to try and pull back that detail here. And more than likely, considering how much shadow detail is in the shot, this would be so blown out that even with Photoshop and Lightroom, you wouldn't be able to pull back any of that detail. So yes, you could use Flash in this scene in order to fill up all the shadow detail, but I kind of like this sort of high contrast look, and it's something that I'm often favoring whenever I have the opportunity. But it's really important to keep an eye out for scenes like this, because they can be so much better and so much more interesting than shots that are made under really flat, boring lighting. This kind of lighting is happening all the time, but you have to have a keen eye and be conscious of it in order to be able to take advantage of it when the opportunity presents itself. Hope this was helpful to you. If you're finding us for the first time, the Candid Frame is actually a podcast in which we released interviews with photographers from all over the world of different genres of photography. You can find it by visiting thecandidframe.com. We also have new episodes that appear on this YouTube channel every week, but we also have a Candid Frame app available for Windows, Android, and Apple iOS, which allows you access to the full 340 plus interviews that we provided. Our most recent interview was with Tony DeZino, a sports and photographer who has been doing a lot of work recently with motion and video. So if you have an interest in exploring that aspect of photography and video capture, check out the interview. It's a really, really good one. And that's it. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.